Miigwech, merci beaucoup. Thank you for joining us for our Lunchtime Health Sciences webinar today, entitled Telesupervision in the Health Sciences Professions, How to Adapt to Our New Realities. And the webinar today is going to be delivered by Mariska and Lauren Tittley from the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill University. I'm Dr. Michael Ravnick, the manager of the Health Sciences programs at NOSM. And before we get started, I'm just going to do some quick welcomes and introductions. And so this is our typical agenda for the lunchtime webinar. There will be a moderated Q&A period, so please do put your questions in the chat. You can wait until the Q&A period at the end of the presentation, or you can add them throughout, and I'll certainly keep track of them and make sure that the questions get brought forward. Just a reminder about your camera and microphone. Please do keep those off for the duration of the webinar. During the question period, if you prefer to ask your question by putting your microphone on, then that's okay, but please do keep them off for the duration of the webinar until we get to that point. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube within a couple of weeks. All of our previous webinars are now actually already on YouTube, and you can find those links to the recordings on our Rehabilitation Sciences and NOTIF websites in the resources sections. Or you can find the webinars directly through the NOSM TV channel on YouTube. So we acknowledge the land upon which NOSM is located to raise awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights, and to acknowledge the colonial history and current history in Ontario and Canada as a whole. We humbly ask that wherever you're calling in from today, that you do think about the land and areas where you work and reside. The Northern Ontario School of Medicine respectfully acknowledges that the entirety of the school's wider campus of Northern Ontario is on the homelands of First Nations and Métis peoples. The medical school buildings at Laurentian University and Lakehead University are located on the territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, specifically Atikameksheng and Wanapatawpii First Nation and Fort William First Nation. So I'll start by introducing Lauren Tittley. Lauren is a faculty lecturer in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at McGill University and a certified speech-language pathologist. She supervises students in the school's teaching clinic and is involved in the training and support of clinical educators. She's particularly interested in the treatment of acquired language disorders, the clinical education of students in the field of speech-language pathology, and the training and support of clinical educators. Our second speaker today is Mariska. Mariska is also a faculty lecturer in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at McGill, and also a certified speech-language pathologist. She supervises students in the McGill Daycare Satellite Clinic and is involved in the training and support of clinical educators. She received the Award of Excellence in Clinical Education in 2015, and her specific interests lie in the area of alternative and augmentative communication and student supervision. Merci beaucoup. Miigwech, thank you, Lauren and Mariska, for your time today. We truly appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us on telesupervision. And I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for having us. I'm going to pull up our presentation here, and we will get started. I'm new to WebEx, so if I mess up, you guys can I'll have to have a little patience with me. It's not the platform we usually use, but there we go. I think I've got it going. So that was such a lovely introduction from Mike. Thank you. I feel like we don't need to say a lot more, but Mariska, is there anything else you wanted to add about yourself?
Oh, we're good. I think we're all ready to get started.
Yeah, great. So I did just want to add that it was kind of fun in the days leading up to this. I was reflecting on the fact that it's about, I guess, 14 years ago right now, I was in Wawa completing my first clinical placement in speech-language pathology. I went to U of T, and that placement was organized through NOSM, so it was kind of a fun connection. We actually have two McGill speech language pathology students who are headed, one to Thunder Bay, one to Sault Ste. Marie, to start in a couple weeks their final internship. So we definitely have connections to the region. We also wanted to acknowledge the land that McGill University is situated on. We're situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. And we recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka as traditional custodians of the lands where we work at McGill. And we've really had the great fortune of working more and more closely with the Kanien'kehá:ka community the last few years, developing several collaborative projects, clinical placements in their community with the Kahnawake Education Center in particular. And so we really appreciate and value their contribution to the clinical education of our students. We also wanted to acknowledge that this presentation that you're going to see here today, it was mostly based on a presentation that Mariska and I developed really specifically for speech language pathology clinical educators. And so when we decided to do this for a wider population of clinicians, we reached out to some other people to try to broaden the presentation. So Mary Hendrickson is a registered dietitian at McGill and organizes stages for their in the School of Human Nutrition at McGill. Caroline Storr is an occupational therapist, and Martha Vicentin, a physiotherapist, and they both work in McGill's School of Physical and Occupational Therapy, and they were really great helping us out with their perspectives. And we don't actually have an audiology program at McGill, but we did consult with Dr. Sarah Mason, who is an audiologist who works out of the audiology program at Dalhousie. And so all of these people were very generous with us with their time to help us make sure that what we were talking about applied not just to SLP supervisors, but more broadly to health professions, the other health professions. So today, we're going to start off with talking about what is telesupervision, what can it look like, what are the different models. We did look into the research about telesupervision and pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages. We want to bring you some feedback from our own supervisors and students, and then give you some kind of key elements to consider if you're taking this on. And then a whole bunch of how-tos, kind of the nitty-gritty steps, things that we have discovered in the past year. So actually, before we jump right in, we like this quote from Dr. Mariska, that really it's these kind of more digital devices and online solutions are really important for any health professionals moving forward. And so it's really valuable for our students to gain experience in this. As with, I'm sure many of you, Mariska and I were thrown into telepractice very abruptly last April, when our clinics were shut down. And so this whole presentation was born out of necessity. We kind of figured it out as we went along, not just telepractice, but also supervising clinical students over telepractice, and then realized that, maybe we could help out other people who were supervising with kind of what we had figured out. So there's nothing real magical in this presentation. It's mostly kind of what we have figured out together over the last year. We like this definition of telesupervision, a process whereby distant supervision is provided using electronic information and communication technologies. One thing we really like about it is that it leaves it open. So we usually think of video conference when we're thinking telesupervision, stuff like WebEx and Zoom, but it can be supervision that you do over the phone. It can include using email, anything where you are not present with your student and you're using, some kind of electronic or communication technology to provide that supervision. There are several different setups. We've realized several different ways this can look. One is where the supervisor, the student, the client are all remote. Everybody's sitting at home. This was the situation last spring when the pandemic first hit and everything was shut down. Mariska and I both found ourselves in this situation. This is actually still how I am practicing with my teaching clinic at McGill. So I sit at home, my students sit at home, the clients sit at home, we all connect on Zoom. So that's one way that it can look. Another way is sometimes we've had placements where the supervisor is on site with the client. and the student is remote. So this winter, actually, Mariska was in that situation. She supervises in a daycare at McGill, and she was allowed back on site, but the students were not. So she was at the daycare with the children, and the SLP students were connecting virtually to the sessions. Another possible situation is one where the student is on site with the client and the supervisor is remote. And I think Mariska is switching to that this summer, where her students, they have more experience. They'll be given some more autonomy. They're going to be on site with the kids, and she'll be supervising from home, connecting into them. So there's a lot of different ways it can look. Key to this is we're really talking about when the supervisor and the student are remote from each other. So certainly you might be in a situation where you are on site and your student is with you and you are engaging in telepractice with a client. In that situation, there's a lot of important stuff about telepractice you need to consider, but the supervision itself is a lot more just like any face-to-face placement, right? Because you're present with your student. So what we were really interested in is, what does supervision look like when you are not present with your student? And another important note here is that lots of placements now are really moving back and forth between lots of these different models. They might start out one way and switch to another. They might at times be everybody on site and then switch to some telesupervision. So it's becoming very, very flexible. We wanted to bring up some specific clinical applications and examples of how we have seen this carried out this year, or things we've heard from our collaborators. So for example, in physiotherapy and audiology, they've been doing a lot of in-person assessments with their students present on site, and then things will go to remote for follow-up sessions, the supervision as well. So the students will go back home, the clients are home, and they connect, later on over video conference. In both speech pathology and in physiotherapy, we've had situations where we have some in-person training, and then the students might go somewhere else and get remote supervision. So the clients, are remote, or the training at the beginning is in person, and then the intervention might be direct, but the supervisor is remote. We've had dietitian students who are on site at the hospital, and a supervisor is at home because she was at higher risk and so couldn't be on site. Both speech and OT have done some classroom intervention via telepractice, where maybe the supervisor is on site at the school and the SLP or OT students are connecting in through telepractice to the classroom's whiteboard. So there's lots and lots of different examples here. Remote cooking classes in dietetics. As I was saying before, kind of all parties can be remote, the way my clinic's working now. And one interesting one, more from the perspective kind of coordinators of stage, is lots of meetings between the stage coordinators at the university and the supervisors on site are happening via telepractice, which is nice and offers more opportunity for kind of support of supervisors when the coordinator from the university can't be on site. So we wanted to get into what the research actually says about this. So we took a look to find out, is telesupervision as good as in-person supervision, excuse me. And what we found in the research was that in a lot of aspects, telesupervision is found to be just as effective as in-person supervision. So for building a relationship between the supervisor and supervisee, for the quality of student learning, for the development of student confidence, and somewhat surprisingly, student satisfaction with the supervision and placement was also on par in all of these studies for in-person or remote supervision. These studies that we looked, they did include examples from speech language pathology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and social work counseling placements. So they did look at kind of a broad range of health professionals and health professional students. And you'll see there's a little caveat there under relationship that a lot of the studies did find that although relationship building could be done effectively through telesupervision, it did help to have an in-person meeting near the beginning of the placement or before the placement started. So whenever that was possible, that did help. The research did identify some advantages and challenges in telesupervision. So some of the advantages were greater student autonomy. Students took more independence. Supervisors let them take more independence. Certainly greater flexibility, you know, in terms of the supervisor didn't need to be on site. A lot of these studies, one of them actually was done post-COVID during the pandemic last summer. But a lot of these studies were done pre-COVID, and they were more focused on kind of getting services to remote communities. A lot of them come from Australia, where, you know, they're very spread out, similar to how we are. And so looking at, you know, could you put students on site and have a remote supervisor in order to get more services to more remote communities? So they found that flexibility in terms of the location of the supervisor was a nice advantage. Opportunities in remote for placements in remote areas, there were, you know, increased opportunities, and obviously more time efficient if you're, you know, doing telepractice and you don't have to travel. And the supervision was often more structured. So I think because you're having to make appointments to connect online, you know, the supervision was very much planned out a lot more than it is often in an in-person supervision situation. Some of the challenges identified, obviously top of the list, you won't be surprised to see, was technology and connectivity issues. We were just chatting with Mike yesterday about how sometimes, you know, connecting to audio can be hard, and maybe you'll need to call in to webinars or telepractice sessions. So, you know, this is the same when you're supervising. There can be technology issues. Obviously, there are limitations for any kind of practice that has to be hands-on. So this is a much bigger deal in some professions like physical therapy, you know, where they have to do a lot more hands-on practice than speech language pathology does, depending on your caseload. Audiology, you know, it's a really big deal. They really need their devices for testing. So obviously, you know, those elements were difficult, not just to do over telepractice, but also to supervise. If you can't be on site beside your student when they're doing some of these things, it's more challenging. Limited opportunities for students to interact with other professionals. So certainly, you know, if the student is not on site with the interprofessional team, then there's much less of that just kind of casual interactions and communicating with other team members. It can definitely be more demanding on your time. This is kind of the flip. There was an advantage that it's more time efficient, but certainly you kind of have to be more intentional. There's a lot more planning that can have to go into it. So certainly we have found, we agree with this point in the research, that it can take more time. And then you'll see I have on the challenges side, supervision is more structured. They found in these studies that it was both an advantage and sometimes a disadvantage. There was less of that kind of just casual interaction with the student. And so that was sometimes great to be more organized and structured about it, and sometimes not so great. We surveyed our supervisors. We have continued to do so all year because we've had a lot of placements that have been done via telesupervision. And the feedback from our supervisors has very much lined up with this. We've heard a lot of the same things from our supervisors. A couple other challenges that they identified were giving students access to charts. So any placements that happen within health institutions, it's been quite a challenge to give off-site students access to health charts, to medical charts. That's been something that supervisors have had to figure out how to work around. And then they did find a lot of people that developing relationships was harder. Not that it couldn't be done, but that it took more work to develop that kind of working relationship with your student. Overall, however, despite those challenges that they identified, we did get very positive feedback from our supervisors. And this, what I'm showing you here, is actually from last summer. So this, I like to show this one because we were not supporting our supervisors that well last summer. I think Mariska and I were, you know, doing our best just to tread water and do this ourselves. So any other supervisors who took on students for McGill last summer, for SLP anyways, you know, we supported them as we could, but it wasn't like they got special training like this or anything. And yet they felt really good when we asked them at the end of the placements, how did it go? You know, did you feel like you provided quality supervision? Did you gain satisfaction? Did your student develop their competencies? We got, you know, mostly very much agree and strongly agree. So certainly in our experience, telesupervision has been, you know, just as good, if sometimes different than in person. We also, of course, wanted to find out what the students thought. And so some of these are direct quotes from our students who we have surveyed, who have been participating in telesupervision and in telepractice placements, that they got to practice their clinical skills, got to be maybe had to be more adaptable, and that was a positive. That the not having a commute was nice. That they developed their clinical their clinical experience was on the same level as face-to-face placement. Maybe gave them a new perspective on therapy. Had to use creativity. Certainly some, complaints about isolation. I think that's just the nature of what all of us have been experiencing if we're not on site, less of that connection with other people. So that was hard. And something that we heard a lot from our own students, and then from basically every other professional that we talked to who works in the training of health students in other disciplines, also said it, that the students initially were very resistant, as were a lot of the supervisors, but then really saw the benefits very quickly. And at this point, a lot of students at McGill anyways have been asking for telepractice placements throughout the year. So certainly the students did end up seeing a lot of benefits. Okay, so we're switching. That was kind of the research and our own experience in terms of supervisors and student feedback. Now we wanted to identify just a few kind of main themes, critical elements to keep in mind if you are engaging in telesupervision. The first one is that we started saying this a lot at the beginning, but we feel it's still true and it's still important to say that a lot of us are still kind of new to this. Telepractice, maybe now you're feeling good about telepractice, but telesupervision, maybe it's the first time you will take a student and not be present with them on site, and that can make you nervous. And so we had a lot of our own, supervisors saying, I don't feel ready. I'm still learning stuff. I'm not ready to take a student because I don't feel comfortable, which is completely understandable, but we like to push back against that and say, actually, it's really great to be learning something new in front of your student. It's a great model for them about how you have to continue to grow and learn and develop, over the course of your professional career. Also, your student can help you acquire new skills. Mariska and I have both found that, wow, like our students become pros at telepractice, and it's really fun to see everything that they figure out how to do. It's very helpful in our learning. So there's a lot of real pros, and even if you're feeling uncertain about exactly what you're doing, whether it's telepractice or telesupervision, still can be really, really great to take a student. We would say that what can be really helpful is to identify somebody who you can turn to for help. So that might be a colleague. Mariska and I have been buddies through this all the way through, kind of learning together, supporting each other, asking and answering questions. It might be a mentor, somebody who has done it already. We have our emails at the end of this presentation if you want to ask us. Now we've been through about a year of it, so we're certainly happy to answer questions. The coordinator of clinical education from the university who is sending you students should be able to support you in this. Find somebody who you can turn to so that you don't feel alone, because we are all in this together, as we like to say, cheesily. The second kind of big critical element we like to hit on is confidentiality. This is a big concern when not everybody is on site with all the files and electronic records and everything. So it's certainly something you have to think about. We actually put in place a student confidentiality agreement right from the start. It's very simple. We drafted it ourselves based on some other things we read, but the students have to read it and sign it and agree to certain things like having a secure and private space to work in, so that they have a room where they can close the door, nobody can overhear sessions if they're participating from home, for example, that they won't, if they do have access to student charts online, that they will not download and save personal client information on their own devices. So we have all of our students sign these at the beginning of every placement. If you are interested in this, also feel free to email and I can send you a copy of ours if you don't have one, but we have found it a nice thing just to really, it's a good point of discussion too with the students to start about how to manage the confidentiality in this kind of setting. And then just managing client files and client information is tricky. You got to really think it through, and it's very dependent on your specific situation. So it's really great if you have some kind of secure drive. You know, if you are in a hospital and you do have electronic medical records and you can access it from home and you can get your student to sign in, you know, a secure login, fantastic. Isn't that great? You know, and they can actually use that. It's a nice secure space to chart from. If you don't, some other options, we now use OneDrive, Microsoft OneDrive for Business, because it's actually confidential or secure for confidential information. And so we keep all of our client files on there. So, and we give our students access to specific folders so that they can chart in there. Alternatively, if you don't have access to a secure drive like that, some things that we were doing at the beginning before we figured this out was stuff like having a Google Docs, and the students would chart, write a session note using pseudonyms or initials, and then Mariska or I would then download the note and add in the confidential information and save it on a secure drive. So that's, you know, more cumbersome, but certainly there are ways around it if you don't have a secure drive. But what we say to everybody is check with your own IT department, because hopefully there is an easier solution. But no matter what, there are ways around it. And then our third kind of big essential point is just to really think carefully about the technology. So obviously, wherever your student is connecting from, unless it's a situation where they are on site with the client and you're remote, well, even then, I mean, you need a way to connect with them. So the student, wherever they are, needs to have reliable internet connection, obviously, and reliable technology and devices. University programs may have supports in place for their students. I know in our program at McGill, we, you know, whenever a student gets assigned to a placement where they'll have to do some telepractice, if they identify that they do not have adequate setup or devices at home, then they have the option to book a telepractice unit on site, and they can come and be on their own in an office where they can use a computer and webcam and everything at the school. So, you know, there might be a situation like that, but I mean, the university should be taking care of that at the student end. You just more need to think about it at your end, and to make sure that you have backup plans, because I'm sure you are all aware that technological problems do occur. So, you know, making sure you have your student's phone number and that they have yours in case you guys lose connection. Having a backup device ready to switch to in case problems with device. You know, data. I've had to switch to the data on my phone and hotspot from there when my internet goes down, my Wi-Fi goes down. So just having thought through those kinds of backups so that you can make sure you can still connect. And so those were our kind of theoretical things. Now this is, I'm turning it over to Mariska, who's going to walk you through kind of our hot tips, how to do this telesupervision.
Or as Lauren would say earlier, the nitty-gritty of the how-tos. So what we did is we actually divided this in 3 different sections. So our planning section, our teaching supervising section, and evaluating debriefing section. And I think that what Lauren already mentioned is that we've both realized that we do need to factor in a little bit of extra time for all these 3 areas. Maybe a little bit more at the beginning. The more comfortable you get with telesupervision, it gets better, but I think the students need a little bit of extra time in all these areas. So let's go to the planning phase. Of course, when we bring a student on site, or when we start working with a student, we want to orient that learner to the site and also to the clients and the workplace, of course. So at the daycare at this point, where I'm still on site and my students are remote, I literally do a little walkthrough with my laptop on my arm, and I walk them through the building. And I think that it makes a huge difference for the students to build that connection to the site, which of course is a little bit more difficult if they are remote. And I take that time on the first day to introduce them to maybe some of the educators, the director. I show them around, let them have a quick look at the classrooms, and it really helps them connect to that site. If they're going to be engaging in telepractice, so if they are remote, I also want to, at that beginning, verify what their level of expertise and experience is with telepractice. If they haven't done telepractice, I do make sure that I set some additional time aside at the beginning to talk them through. If they're using a different telepractice platform at their university than what you might be using on site, it's really important to introduce them to that. I know that Mike took some time with us yesterday to introduce us to WebEx because we had not used it, or at least not used it in a while. And I even dive into all those special features of the platforms to make sure that they know how to use them with the client. So Lauren, for instance, uses a lot of Annotate, where I use like visual or virtual backgrounds. So we really, when we're orienting our learner, want to give them some time to explore all those features.
I will say, just before we move to the next slide, that certainly at McGill, we explicitly trained our students this year in telepractice. We added some modules into the training, and I think that's that's happening pretty broadly with most health science students these days. So the students at this point would probably come to you with at least some knowledge of telepractice.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we mentioned, considering a little bit more time for everything, but also for the students' development. So what we've noticed is that Lauren and I like to throw in our students very early on. We don't let them observe for weeks on end. They come to us, may do a bit of observation, but then we get them started on things. But what we've realized is that for certain clinical skills, they do need a little bit more time to observe you, especially if they're observing you remotely. So when we're orienting the learner, when we're trying to schedule and plan, we want to set a little bit more time aside for observation. And then one last thing we added when we were talking about orienting our learner, and this is something we added after speaking to some of of the other professionals, is that you want to inform your student, if you are engaging in telepractice with the client, how you adapted and changed your practice for the client. So I was thinking about that myself, and I think that before we started doing telepractice, our sessions may have been a little longer. So the setup of my session definitely changed a little bit. And I want my students to know that, because they may have not had that type of instruction in school. So how do I adapt? My sessions may be a little bit shorter. I may structure them a little bit more with visual schedules for my little ones at the daycare. Also, my clinical activities may have changed a little bit. I might be selecting some different tests that they're not familiar with, or that I might have not used in previous placements because I don't have tests online for them. So, and materials, I might select some different materials, whereas at the daycare we might use lots of hands-on materials. Now we're doing everything online. So I want them to be aware that reality has changed a little bit. Maybe my interpersonal skills, I have adapted. I might be doing more check-ins with my patient. When we're all remote, I might be checking in more with the parent than I would if they're on site with us. So I want to be very clear about that when I'm talking to the students, and I do that all when I'm orienting them. We also realize that the selection of our clients may be a little bit different. I used to see 0 to 5 at the daycare, but at the moment I will not give under 3 to my students because it's just too complicated via telepractice, and I want them to be aware of that. So that's all stuff that I discuss with them when I'm orienting them. Next slide, please. So another part of planning, and Lauren touched on this a little bit already, is like, how can we give them access to materials? And that's, how do we give them access to the online charts, but also how do they have access to assessments and treatment materials? So we're at this point, when it comes to assessment materials, using a lot of Q Global, Pearson's Q Global platform for a lot of our tests, but we also have some materials online. And we're sharing those either via our OneDrive, as Lauren mentioned, and we used to do this via our Google Drive. Students, of course, have often access to digital materials through the university. And our students have been amazing in finding materials online or creating their own materials. We've had lists of websites coming in from our students of materials they found and resources they found. And we've created kind of like a sharing bank, so students have access to that from semester to semester. So that's pretty helpful. But we discussed it with them ahead of time so that they don't feel at a loss, like, how am I going to develop all this? We really give them access to this way ahead of time so that they can start looking into those materials. And then, as Lauren mentioned in the confidentiality section, we also want to spend quite some time on how do we document if a student is not on site, if they can't have access to those files directly. I think that Lauren mentioned already that we currently have everything on a OneDrive, so they have access that way. We share our documents that way. But for some of you who may not be online charting yet, what other options are there? So we want to discuss that with your students ahead of time. I know that one of our colleagues had been still charting on paper, and she had the students write SOAP notes and reports and send them via email encrypted with a password. So those are all options, but you want to clarify that with the students before they start their placement or on their first day.
And just back to materials too, you know, we focus a lot on digital materials because we're doing a lot of telepractice, but your students, whether they're doing telepractice or if they're, you know, on site with a client and you're remote, they might be using some physical materials as well. So you want to think that through too. Do they know either where to find it on site if they're on site and you're not, or do they know where, you know, can they borrow stuff from the hospital or the university or something if they are not present where there are physical materials that they're going to need?
We're organizing pickups as we speak for students to go collect the materials. And then, as Lauren mentioned, the organizing just the logistics. So make sure that you have that student's phone number, what to do in case internet breaks down, to have all those things organized ahead of time. We said that in the challenges and in the areas that that work well, that oh my goodness, I lost my train of thought here, that the feedback is a little bit more structured, and you want to really set time aside for those case discussions and feedback ahead of time, which makes it a little bit easier for the students. And thinking about how to plan for the placement when you're doing a lot of telepractice, like making sure that there's time for bathroom breaks, screen breaks. We all know that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. And to also schedule more time for setting up for a new client. So giving them more time in between clients, not booking too much back to back. I also try to involve my students in that planning. Of course, in the beginning, we help them with that, but eventually students are going to plan their schedules themselves, and you want to give them a heads up on all these areas, like make sure that you have a little screen break and that you have enough time to open all your new documents for your next client. Telesupervision really doesn't mean being online all day. I actually received a note from a student this week that said, oh, this was very different than being on site with a CE for 8 hours a day. And I was kind of thinking to myself, students really feel that they need to have that CE, that clinical educator or that supervisor with them 8 hours a day. But we all know they need to have time to work on things on their own. So telesupervision also doesn't mean that we have to be online with them all day. And when we're talking about our during section, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And the last part under planning would be that we want to be a little bit more deliberate about creating that positive learning environment. One of the things that we find really important is to clarify the expectations. In our program, we have our students complete a practicum contract where we set their goals, and as part of that, we sit with the students and just discuss their experience with telepractice. And if they have very little experience, we might decide to add some goals specifically on that into their learning objectives. At the same time, you're of course discussing the goals of the placement and maybe any adaptations that you've made to your site. You might be adding those as well. You also would be keeping in mind the impact of telepractice on clinical skills. What we've seen is that overall students seem to be developing all those competencies, but maybe in the first few weeks, we do see that progress is a little bit slower than what we would see in person, because students are just managing more if they're doing a telepractice placement or a telepractice aspect as part of an intervention session, for example. So we want to, when we're looking at their development, keep that in mind. And being very deliberate about regular check-ins and reviewing expectations, of course, really important. The one thing that we saw that some of our supervisors found a little bit more difficult was that building rapport. It must be done a little bit more intentionally. So when my students at the daycare arrive via telepractice on my screen, we always take a few minutes in the morning just to have that chit chat, like how was your day, how was prep yesterday, what's going on, just to have time to build rapport. So we've set virtual coffee breaks to get to know each other. Also introducing those students to your team if possible, it really helps them get more comfortable with the site. And as Lauren had mentioned already, an in-person meeting can be very helpful. Now, of course, all depending on where your student is, that might not always be possible, but if they're in your area, and once restrictions allow, an in-person meeting can be really helpful to build that rapport. Which brings us to our next section, the during section. So once you've planned for your placement, you're of course going to start seeing your clients. We wanted to talk about like a session. What will that look like? So we want to connect with our students just before the session. So before we bring in the client, which either means bringing the client in the room or bringing the client on screen, we want to have that quick connection to do a few check-ins with the student. So I like to take that time to review the session plan with my students. So what specifically are you working on with the client, but then also what expectations I have of the student. So if they're working on something very specific in regards to learning objective, I want to highlight that so that they really have that quick moment of instruction before they start their session. At that same time, I also take a little bit of time to verify the technology and to discuss any troubleshooting plans. So like, do we have a backup for Wi-Fi? Do we have our phone numbers? Do we have everything open? Did I make you a co-host? Can you share your screen? So we want to take some time with the student to make sure that they have everything ready to go. And then we also take some time to discuss how am I going to give you feedback during that session. And that maybe we may choose to do that via a private chat. We may decide to do that via a quick thumbs up or maybe even a text, whatever works at that point. But what Lauren and I noticed is that we want to always be mindful of the feedback we give during a session, because it's a little bit more distracting to get that feedback via a screen or via a text, because it requires the student to leave the client for a second and read. So we do want to be mindful. It really needs to be feedback that's important in that moment. And if it can wait, then it should probably wait, because it also can distract the client from the session and the student from the client. So we want to be mindful about that. So once we've connected with our students, we'll be ready to see the client. And depending on what session it is, if it's the first session, I do like to take some time to introduce myself and then the student. But I very quickly like to pass that on to my students. I want them to take the opportunity at the beginning of the session to do a little rapport building with the client. But of course, if it's the first session, I will model that, and I will do that with the client to show the student. If I'm observing a session and I'm not actively participating, so if the student is ready to run a session completely independently, I will try to limit distractions as much as possible, and I'll let the client know, like, I will be listening in, but my camera will be off, my microphone will be off, so that I will not distract you in the session and that the student can really focus on the session as well. I do let the client know that I may be giving a student feedback if need be, so that they're aware that I may at one point turn on my camera or my mic. And if they're, this will happen probably when we're doing maybe a first intake or an assessment. If a student would kind of want to pass a couple of ideas by me, then I may replace that client back into a waiting room so that we have a few minutes to talk in person and then bringing the client in. I guess that people would probably do that when we're thinking about like a recommendation we want to give and the student wants to pass it by the supervisor first. So sometimes bringing that client back into a waiting room for a little private chat is possible, but we do let the client know about that. During this session, your level of participation will vary, just like it will in person. Sometimes you're leading a session and students will just maybe do little parts or try things. Sometimes you're co-leading or co-teaching. Sometimes you're simply observing, or you might be supervising indirectly. You're not present at all. But all these work via telepractice. So these are all options of supervision that you can give. The supervising indirectly would be that you're not observing the session, but you're going to connect with your student afterwards, of course, and the student will talk you through and you'll give them feedback based upon that. But all these options work as part of a telesupervision placement. There are a couple of clinical teaching strategies that we like to discuss with our CEs, and that we feel specifically transfer well to telesupervision. And one of them we discussed already is priming, where we take a few minutes just before a client to talk to students through what are the client's goals, what activities are you going to do, and what specific learning objectives are you going to keep in mind for yourself. So are you working on your speech rate? Are you working on your interpersonal skills? Are you looking at a very clinical skill? Are you going to work on a telepractice skill? So just to give the student that quick rundown of what you're looking for in regards to the student's performance. Reflective modeling works really well, where you may be demonstrating a skill and you're talking to students through it. You're kind of narrating it as you go, and then teaching in the patient's presence. So maybe a student is doing an intake and you might ask the student in the moment, like, what does that make you think of? So doing a little bit of teaching in the patient's presence. There's a link here at the bottom, Heidenreich et al., and we have this article on these clinical teaching strategies linked in our resources at the end. We find it a very helpful resource for our supervisors. So once the session's completed, you're going to have time to sit with the student and to have a feedback session. And it's really very similar to in-person placements. You will have set time aside specifically for feedback, or maybe even just a case discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, I involve my students in this planning. So for this summer, excuse me, I'll have 2 students doing a final internship, and they'll be running their own caseloads. So I really sit with them and say, okay, what does your plan look like for this week? Who are you seeing, and where do you want me to come and observe you, and where are we going to do some feedback, so that the students really know when they have access to me, and also if they have a more complicated client, that they can have me there. So it's really important to schedule that ahead of time, because our schedules fill up quickly, of course. The feedback sessions can be scheduled either after each client or as it fits in your schedule, but it is important to really set time aside every day for a little bit of feedback. When we've done our feedback sessions and students have some unsupervised time for prep and documentation, I usually discuss that plan with the students. So what are you going to be working on while I'm working on XYZ in my own office, or what documentation am I expecting from you at the end of your 2-hour block where you're working independently. It's of course different when we're doing a telesupervision placement. If I have students in person, they can just come to my office and ask me questions. So I make sure that if students are offline working on materials or on documentation, that they do know how to reach me. So either via email, or they can have a quick Zoom session with me. But I let them know specifically when I'm available. And it's really key, because sometimes they run into issues and they want to make sure that they can have those answered. And we, of course, do need to evaluate our students. And Lauren and I realize that not all, but many clinical skills, as we have identified, do transfer to telepractice. And we really feel that most clinical skills are easy to evaluate via telesupervision. We're observing our students. We're observing them via a smaller screen, but we're observing them and we're reading their reports just like we would normally. So there's not that much of a difference in regards to evaluation. The only point we do want to point out, or the only point we want you to keep in mind, is that when we're looking at clinical and technological competence, that if a student was really new to this kind of a telepractice setup, that we want to keep that in mind. And I think specifically for us, like we do a midterm and a final, usually week 6 and week 12. We do want to maybe have a little bit more reserved expectations for the midterm, because they are managing so much in regards to like telepractice and being supervised remotely, so that they may develop those earlier skills a little bit slower, but we've seen that usually by the end of the practicum, they have reached all their competencies. So you want to just maybe keep that in mind and have those little bit more reserved expectations for the earlier weeks of the placement. And for some of our students, they really know and they have understood that telepractice is here to stay. So we do sometimes consider explicitly evaluating telepractice specific skills. Some of my students said, I really want to work on behavior management via telepractice. So these are goals that can be added and can be officially evaluated at the end of a placement. Next slide. That brings us, 12:50, right at the end. So I think that Mike, we're going to pass it back to Mike now. Here, our email addresses are here, so if you have questions after the session, then feel free to email us. But I know that Mike is going to narrate or moderate a quick Q&A with questions that you already had in the chat.
And we have shared we've shared the slides with Mike as well. So if you want a copy of those, I think he's going to make those available. And our email addresses are there, as well as all the references at the end.
Yes, thank you so much, Lauren and Mariska. That was fantastic. And thank you for also sharing your slides. And if you also wanted to share that confidentiality agreement that you had mentioned, I'd be happy to put that
Sure.
Where the recording for this webinar is going to be located in our resources. I wanted to just make a couple of comments before we open it up for questions. I really like the emphasis on having backup plans, right, with this, because inevitably technology will fail at the least opportune time. And having that contingency in place, I think, is important. So I really liked your emphasis on that, and the fact that you do have to be much more intentional with things than what you would during an in-person placement. I also really liked how you set up talking about your tips or strategies for preceptors, thinking about it before, during, and after those encounters with clients. And you, at the beginning of the presentation, spoke about one of the challenges in that there's fewer opportunities for the students or the learners to actually interact with other disciplines or other learners from other disciplines. And we have been trying to manage that as best we can, because certainly IPE is something we really want to promote in Northern Ontario with our placements. So we've actually set up a Facebook group for the learners coming to Northern Ontario to share different virtual IPE opportunities. But it's certainly a challenge, and maybe something, again, that you would have to be a little bit more intentional with during a placement. So my question, and before, as I'm asking this question, please, if anyone does have any other questions, please put them into the chat, and I'll also open it up in a minute for an opportunity for people to take themselves off their mute. So my question was around the time and the extra time that you're saying that it requires in supervising students virtually, because time is already a challenge for many clinicians because of their caseloads and nature of their practice. So you had actually mentioned that unlike kind of the in-person placements where you're not necessarily with your learner for 8 hours a day, but at the same time that there's more time involved in the preparation. So I'm wondering if there's a balance or a trade-off there in terms of the amount of time that you're doing preparing versus not necessarily having to be with your learner for 8 hours a day.
Yeah, I think you really hit on it, Mike, that we did find that certainly the planning takes more time. You need to kind of think things through in a way that you didn't necessarily, at least the first time you do it, you know. I mean, I think now we're at a point where, it's like supervising in person. We don't need to plan that carefully. We're rolling. We know how to do it. But certainly when you get started in it, there's just more to consider. And so you do need that extra time for planning. But yeah, I think the time away from your students is easier to get when they're not sitting in your office beside you. So certainly you feel a little bit more freedom, you know, to do your own thing and to give them their own independent time to work on stuff. I think that, and the time that you spend on the feedback and case discussions is more pointed, you know, it's more intentional, it's more organized. You get online, and that was what we were talking about, you know, it kind of the downside is, you know, kind of the less chit chat rapport building, but the upside is like it's more efficient. You get on there, you say, okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about this. Great. What are you going to do until the next time I see you? Okay, perfect. See you later. So certainly in that respect, it can make the time spent with your student more efficient and give you more time to get everything else that you need to get done. Mariska? I think we've lost I think your mic's off, Mariska.
I'm totally unmuted. I'm totally unmuted. I think that Lauren and I are also a little bit in a luxury position, of course, because we're really on site just for our students, so we don't take on additional clients separately. But I have supervised for McGill before I joined faculty, and I do think that finding that time to do your own things is just important, or else it's hard to supervise students, right? You can't not be doing the same amount of work that you would normally do because your boss is going to want you to do that work. So being in the telesupervision, I think that there is that trade-off. I find that I have more structured time to catch up on things than I would if I'm in the same room with the students. And that's what Lauren is saying. Like, if you say, like, we'll see each other again at 3, the chance that they're not going to walk into my office because they're not there, right? And the chance that they'll send me an email, that's quick, but you have more structured time to work on things. So I think there is that trade-off. I think for students, though, they need to plan a little bit more. They need to really realize that there's going to be a little bit more planning time for these types of placements, and I do like to give them a heads up on that.
Great. Thank you both. So I have other questions, but I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to open it up. If anyone does want to take themselves off mute and ask a question, and I do see Carrie has her hand up, so Carrie, go ahead.
Hello, guys. Thanks for your presentation today. I was in the unique situation where I was doing full virtual student placements even prior to COVID. So I provide speech services across Northern Ontario, and I've often had my students not in the same spot. So a couple of things that, as you were talking about the additional planning time, one thing that I think has happened since the shift to full virtual telepractice is that the boundaries of working hours become very muddled. And I am very much an advocate that, with even almost more importantly than the clinical skills that your students are developing with you during these placements, is learning how to manage your time and learning to work within a set amount of hours. So many of my students come through and they are producing incredible work, but they are also working 14 hours a day. And to me, that's actually even greater cause for concern, because that's obviously not sustainable. We want people to have their own personal lives. So I think that's something you really have to think about, especially with these virtual placements, because you won't see it as much. They're sneakier. They're better at hiding it.
That's true. And that's very true, Carrie. And that actually happened with our placement. So students got really excited about developing materials. They came with these beautiful PowerPoints, but then in their feedbacks, they were indicating, like, I'm really spending a lot of time on prep, but they have access to a lot of beautifully prepared materials that they don't have to make themselves, but they do spend, and it's what you said, you don't see it, right? We have to specifically ask, like, how much time are you spending on this? So those, I think I mentioned at one point, those regular check-ins on expectations and how they're doing when they are alone, that is really important. And I'm glad that you highlighted that, because that is something that we don't see if we're not with them, right? And they do spend a lot more time on preparing for sessions, etc. So it's very good. And work-life balance has, for many people, gone out the window since we transferred more to telepractice, because you're just always in your office, right? So
Yeah.
Lauren,
Me,
do you have an addition?
No, thanks. That was great.
Yeah, the other two things that I just wanted to mention that I found really effective is I use a session planner for my students, and that gives that structure, because planning does take more time, and it also starts to allow them to collate a list of resources that they've used. So I find that really helps me with my supervision, and I give them due dates. So it's always due 48 hours before your client appointment. That really helps. It increases their executive functioning and independence piece too. But the other part is that when you're doing your observations virtually, I'm often creating an email as I am watching them, and then they get that written feedback. And if there's something that we need to kind of debrief on, more so teaching another skill or really talking about a specific part, I'll often do that in our face-to-face. And if we've got consent from the client, recording the session if you're not there, so you can debrief on it after, is really, really helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie.
Yeah.
Those were all great. I think also
That's
the idea of the session plan, right? Giving them a template to be creating those session plans and submitting them to you is great. Some of my students this year started doing it because they weren't together. I coached, supervised students in a peer coached situation. So there's two of them working together. And so they would create Google Docs for their session plan so that they could work on it together, and then give me access also, so I could actually see very clearly their whole thought process and notes to each other. And that was fantastic. It was really a great way for us to communicate. I was going to say offline, it's online, but not while we were, actively together at the same time. So all those communication tools and planning and executive function tools for them became even more important. I agree.
Great questions, great points, Carrie. Thank you so much. I know we are at 1 o'clock now, so I wanted to thank both Mariska and Lauren for your time and for sharing your knowledge today. And if you do have an extra couple of minutes, we can wait to see if other people have questions, but I know that other people might have to get back to work. So thank you so much. I really, really, truly appreciate it. Does anyone else have any questions? You'd like to take yourself off mute?
Hi, it's Tara here. I just wanted to say thanks for this session, because not being the most techie person out there, the telesupervision of students is can be the biggest thing that makes people reluctant about getting into a preceptor relationship with student. So I loved the documents that you provided too, because to have something just sort of visual as a reminder of all of the things that you should be doing to prepare and plan when you're going to be doing telesupervision is really helpful. The biggest thing, can be keeping organized. And if you're not organized, you're going to feel pretty flustered with the whole situation in terms of having a student and being supervised. So I appreciated those handouts as a nice reminder of all of the things to consider, so we can keep ourselves organized and supporting the students the way we need to be. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And Tara, you know what? I involved my students in that organization. When we started, we had when this all happened, I had no online charting. I was charting on paper still. So with my students, we developed online charts, and having them be part of that process was very, very helpful. And I'm not techie either, but we kind of got thrown in. We didn't have a chance, and now I'm presenting on it, you know? So like it is really a matter of just trying it out and getting comfortable with it. And also realizing, you know, like our clients are still out there and they need to be seen, and we need to get our students to have these opportunities. So, you know, anyone adventuring out in this field, I think is just, you know, helping our clients at the same time. So great to have you here, and I'm glad that you're going to try, you know, so that's wonderful.
It was so nice. I just want to say it was nice to hear from Carrie as well. We've been so fortunate to work with a few SLPs across the country who were in that same situation where they were doing a lot of telepractice already. Same kind of thing, mostly serving northern communities, more remote communities. And so they, you know, they've been fantastic in, you know, having that prior knowledge and expertise in helping us along. So anytime you can reach out to somebody who's a little more experienced than you, can be really helpful.
And thank you for offering to be a resource for people. It's fantastic. Truly appreciate that. I know we just have a smaller group now, but before we sign off, does anyone have any last comments or questions? Okay, then. Well, I want to respect your time as well, and I appreciate immensely taking the time to provide us with the presentation today. I know you did a lot of work to remold it and speaking to colleagues and trying to come up with examples for other disciplines. So I think everyone would agree that you did a fantastic job. And as I said, we're going to have the recording posted to YouTube in the near future for the NOSM TV channel, and we'll also have the resources that were mentioned and included in the description. So thank you both very much, and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.